Welcome to What's the Story Dublin, the official Dublin City Council podcast with me, your host, Deirdre Malumbi. This podcast deep dives into the work of all the moving parts that make up Dublin City Council. It also shares news of the Council's latest initiatives and exciting events. In today's episode, we're looking at waste management and recycling. I'm joined today by Sid Daly, who is the Public Domain Officer for Dublin City Council's Waste Management Services. Sid, you are very welcome.
Glad to be here.
Brilliant. Sid, waste management is such a huge topic when it comes to the services provided by Dublin City Council that we will need to dedicate a few episodes to it. But for your part, to start us off anyway, what does your role as Public Domain Officer for Waste Management Services entail? Is there kind of a normal day in your life?
Well, so, yeah, my official title is Public Domain Officer, but Public Domain Enforcement Officer, actually. But Public Domain Enforcement Officer is a more an area-based role. And just where I came on the panel, I ended up getting sent to waste management. And the role of Public Domain Officer in Waste Management Service had only been created about a year previous to when I joined up. But when I joined up, it was 2 weeks before COVID. And so everything just evolved and changed. We had a lady who was the executive scientific officer who managed recycling facilities and recycling services. So I ended up morphing into that role and kind of moving away. So technically my role is recycling services manager, and I also manage the waste prevention awareness section, the green school and stuff. And it's all to do with, recycling properly and preventing waste and all that sort of stuff. Typically there is no such thing as a typical day. I mean, like it's not like in some of the other sections of the council you might be only in one part of the town, like the city, whereas I manage the recycling infrastructure, the entire city. That's the on-street bottle banks and textile banks. We have a number of neighbourhood bring centres, and then we have 3 large civic community sites or recycling centres. So I would manage the contractors, the service providers. I don't have a role in management of our staff and the operations. So I have the likes of Trevor Marr and Jay Brady and Sean Michael Larkin would be the waste manager coordinator. So I'd have to liaise with them in order, they would manage the staff, whereas I manage the facilities and all the contracts and all that sort of stuff. I could be anywhere in the city on any given day. I could be overseeing the reopening of, like a few weeks back, we reopened Amy Kent Park Bring Centre after a lengthy closure due to the refurbishment of the parks that were next door. So we got that back open. So I was doing that. I could be out meeting contractors on site, discussing various issues. I could be out in any of the local area offices, talking to the management out there about, usually about textile banks. And, a lot of, I deal with council questions, I deal with queries from the public. Just so literally the only thing I would say is my morning usually starts off with answering emails, and then whatever happens after that is usually quite reactive. You could go in with a list of 15 things to do on any given day, and you might get one of them done because you're just dealing with complaints or queries or stuff that pops up along the way. So it's never boring, we'll put it that way.
Yeah. And it's interesting, actually, you mentioned that you kind of started around COVID. Did you find that there were some kind of long-term impacts from COVID that kind of permanently affected the work, or was it kind of when we came out of that period that it was back to business as normal? I'd be curious.
Yeah, well, certainly the volumes of materials being deposited in our bring centres and recycling centres over the course of COVID greatly increased. It seemed like certainly during some of the lockdowns, recycling centres were the only places open. So people would be actually, throwing all the kids in the car and going to the recycling centre for a day out because they couldn't do it. Like, I'm not joking. And I think everyone, globally, certainly I think there was a lot more focus on environmentalism and climate action, and during the peak of COVID, like you saw some. I remember seeing some graphics of the lack of gases over cities, like big cities, and like the world was a completely different place. I was hopeful that when we come back out of it, that it might stick as much, but I think people have just kind of gone back to their lives. Like the people that would recycle still recycle. Unfortunately, there are some people who just don't seem to want to pay their bin charges and end up a lot of illegal dumping in some of our on-street bring bags and stuff like that. But I think definitely I would have been hopeful during COVID that the world was going to morph into a better place, but unfortunately it didn't.
Yeah. And we'll get back to some of those kind of topics and issues that you mentioned there, Sid. But for now, how did you actually come into the role? What kind of career trajectory did you take?
Well, we all joke about I do what's called strategic interviewing. So essentially, I started off when I was about 25, starting the council in the finance department, the treasury section. And then after a couple of years, the role of housing advisor was advertised, I was a grade 3 acting grade 4, and I jumped to a grade 5 housing advisor, and then I didn't go for promotion for years after that. And then I think coming out of the moratorium on promotions, during the recession, all that sort of stuff, I was working in the Southeast area office at the time. I was working on the projects team. I was involved in a lot of great stuff there. I wasn't necessarily involved in the public domain role, but I did stuff in the public realm, like myself, and I was in the project team, so we would have done things like did a Rackguard Village Improvement Plan, where we would go out and meet local people and talk to them and see what improvements they wanted, and we made a plan. And over the course of the couple of years, we delivered all that. But then when the role of the public domain officer came up, I was thinking to myself, sure, I'll go for that for practice for an interview, because I'm sure the grade 6s will come up later in the year. And then all of a sudden, I went 357. So we jokingly call it strategic interviewing, but it's just, there was no, I started in the council. Previously I'd worked in a comic shop before that. I had my leaving cert and stuff. I didn't really have any third level education. I do now, thanks to the council's scholarship program. I've got a diploma in public management, but so it was kind of a haphazard career to get there. I ended up, and then essentially, as I say, the interview I went for, I thought was for one of the area-based public domain offices, and I ended up in waste management service, which is ironic, because my dad actually drove a bin lorry for Fingal County Council for 40 years. So for me to end up here now, it's kind of, ironic, I would say.
It's nice having that connection as well, isn't it? It all coming full circle again. And what kind of personality traits do you think to need to work in this area of waste management services?
Resilience, I think, it would be a good one. But I think, good communication skills, somewhat of a background or knowledge of environmental science. There's one particular role within my section, the executive environmental scientific officer, who would have studied environmental science and is a great source of information for all the rest of us who just come up through the councils, go for an interview, and you end up where you end up after the interview.
And would there be times of year when your work gets particularly busy? I'd imagine around holidays and stuff like that, or
yeah, well, going to bank holidays and stuff like that. On holidays, you'd have a lot of additional volumes in some of the bottle banks, for example. But I think Halloween, certainly for the waste management department in general, not just specifically me, is a tricky time, because you're trying to make sure that all the stuff that it would end up on a bonfire doesn't end up on a bonfire. So we would kind of work with some of the local area teams in that regard to provide kind of amnesties for combustible stuff. Like, so for example, in our civic amenity sites where we would accept, furniture and all that sort of stuff, we would then working through the local area offices, and they would then give out amnesty vouchers to their, the local community groups that are involved in their cleanups. So we provide, free kind of recycling of stuff that could otherwise end up on top of a bonfire or end up at Halloween. And Christmas is always busy. The period after Christmas, when people are just getting rid of their Christmas trees, is a fairly intense period. But I think, obviously during the summer months, kind of May, September, there's an increase in, people bringing garden waste and doing their gardens and cutting their trees and all sorts of stuff. So it's kind of, that sort of stuff is seasonal, but like, the rest of the year, your standard, your plastics, your cardboards, bottles, clothes, and that's just all year long,
Yeah, of course. How does the recycling of different kinds of waste in Dublin City, how does that actually work? And I know there's probably so much to that question, but even like, say, the Cliff Notes. Yeah,
well, so essentially, various different waste streams are treated in different ways, depending on, they would all typically end up in a kind of follow the same pattern. Like, for example, you would have your glass bottles are taken, they're crushed down into little pellets, and then they're reconstituted or remade into glass or whatever. Your your plastics, your cardboards, all that sort of stuff, they'll be taken away to a materials recovery facility, where it's then through a load of conveyor belts and hoses and magnets is all separated into all the various different types of waste, and then that's packaged up, and it's unfortunately typically sold to international markets, because there aren't any recycling markets in Ireland, really, aside from possibly compost. Like, so compost that comes in, any garden waste that comes into our bring centres or civic community sites is then taken by a contractor, and then that's processed into compost that's then sold commercially, either by the company themselves or, you know, it's sold to, you know, the likes of B&Q or whatever, them sort of places. If all your wee stuff will be taken out and broken into the component parts, all the various different wires and bits of gadgets and all will be separated and sold out onto markets again. Like, so, and then anything really that isn't, anything that's beyond use really, typically would end up as what's called solid recoverable fuel. So that is essentially fuel that's used in the cement making industry, because it takes, I think your kilns that make cement have to be heated up to something like 1,000 degrees to probably make cement. So a lot of stuff that wouldn't be recyclable or wouldn't be able to be prepared for use might end up in as solid recoverable fuel in the cement making industry.
Wow, there's a huge amount to it. Do you find that you're still kind of like learning on the job about these new kind of techniques and methods that are usable? Yeah, but
fortunately the council sent me on a couple of like waste management courses where I've learned all these sort of things, and you know, we often do day trips with people in the office to some of the material recovery facility to see actually the job in action, like, so to speak. So, you know, it's you know, I think I'm 6 years there now, and it's I've learned quite a lot about waste management in the last 6 years, you know.
And are there factors that kind of make waste management and recycling in Dublin City unique compared to, say, like its national and international counterparts? Or are there maybe aspects, say, internationally that we've kind of drawn inspiration from and that have really worked for Dublin City?
Well, I think for the first part of the question, like, literally we are governed by national legislation, and that's governed by EU legislation. So we have to, like, how we dispose of stuff is all legislated by the EU, and that's how we do our jobs. Like, there's I think last year there was a big push towards the Copenhagen model. They have we had a lady from Copenhagen do a presentation at the SPC last year, I think, and they've delivered a lot of pop-up kind of reuse shops. I think there's a focus coming from the national waste plan for a circular economy. There's a new focus coming in on preparing for reuse and providing facilities to actually where people could kind of do a swap shop kind of thing. Like, but that's all hasn't been developed fully yet, so I'm not sure exactly how what shape it's going to take. But I know, for example, there's 10 civic community sites around the country that will be selected as a trial, and you would imagine that Dublin, one of the ones in Dublin, is going to be one of them. It's standard reason. Like, but I mean, in terms of differences to the rest of the country, like, obviously Dublin is a dense urban population, and it's quite a small place, so we would have a lot of difficulties with things like provision of bottle banks, for example, because the bottle banks from 2001 national planning legislation now precludes bottle banks from being installed anywhere within 50 metres of any residential property. So it's like, I'm from Swords, so out in Swords there'd be a lot more green spaces where there wouldn't be houses around that you could put bottle banks, whereas we, particularly in Dublin 1, Dublin 2, there's no bottle banks in Dublin 1, Dublin 2, because it's, aside from the planning legislation, you also need to factor in the considerations for the service providers. So you have to ensure that they can safely access the bottle banks, for example. So, you know, you can't have overhanging trees or overhead wires. You can't have conflict with bus lanes or cycle lanes. You have the trucks have to be able to easily access, like heavy goods trucks, you know, heavy goods vehicles have to be able to easily access the bottle banks. So it's quite difficult to provide that infrastructure in the city centre, where there literally is, you know, we're dealing with a city that was built in, you know, the 8th, 9th, 10th century, and like I always say, the Vikings weren't very good at future-proofing the city, you know.
And I think you mentioned some of them there, Sid, but what have been some of the bigger challenges faced by your department lately, and how have you guys tackled those issues?
I think certainly for the recycling service, the major issue ongoing, not just in Dublin but around the country, is the textile banks. So you could have, they seem to be a magnet for illegal dumping. You know, people see if we go out and somebody does illegal dumping, we go out and remove it, then they're going to go, oh look, the council get rid of that. So it's vicious circle that you can't, you certainly have all our cleansing operatives in the areas, they have a lot of work to do, so they can only really get to each bottle bank in their area maybe once a day, maybe twice. But then if we get calls in or notifications, we'll get another team to go back out. But scavenging of clothes it's rampant now. You'd have people would be pulling clothes out of clothes banks, going through either to dress themselves or some of it ends up on eBay. I'd imagine.
So dangerous as well. When I see the little kids in there, I'm terrified. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So at the moment we were in the middle of a tender process, which we think we may have a new service provider who might, like according to the tender, have different types of banks that you wouldn't necessarily be able to open as easily as the current ones we have in use. That might prevent some of the scavenging and stuff. But illegal dumping, it's just you're literally chasing your tail. I mean, you could have. I'll give you an example. Beresford Place now. It's not recycling, but Beresford Place up there at the top of O'Connell Street, it's renowned for illegal dumping. And I've had my colleague Trevor Mara was only telling me last week that he was up there. He had something like 20 or 30 bags removed, and he went around the corner, and 10 minutes later he drove back and it was full of illegal dumping again. So it's, you just can't keep up with it. You literally nearly have to have somebody standing on every street corner in the city 24/7, which it's unrealistic. But textiles is the big. Well, there's also the international textile industry has somewhat collapsed over the last few years. You'd have, due to world events such as the invasion of Ukraine, the Houthi pirates in the Suez Canal, so kind of Russia and Ukraine would have been good markets for exporting textiles a couple of years back, but obviously you can't do that now. The Indian subcontinent would also have been a good market, but you can't get through the Suez Canal now, so it's the cost of driving or sailing boatloads of textiles around the Horn of Africa, which just makes it very difficult to or financially constraining, I should say, to get to those markets. So a lot of the markets seem to be opening up in the United Arab Emirates at the moment. But there's also there's the EU Waste Framework Directive. There's changes coming into that in terms of the classification of waste textiles, and there's also a proposed producer extended responsibility scheme similar to We Ireland, or similar to the deposit return scheme that was launched a couple of years ago, but we don't know what form it's going to take now, because it hasn't actually been passed in the European Parliament yet. And then once it's passed there, then our own government and the department and the regional offices have to then come up with a plan of how, I think, if something like 18 months after the legislation is enacted, to develop each country's producer responsibility scheme, and then another 18 months after that to get into action. So hopefully this will improve how textiles are sorted in Ireland, or how dealt with in Ireland. But again, we have to just wait and see exactly what form the scheme takes. I can't imagine it's going to be like you're not going to be bringing your jeans back to pennies and throwing it into a reverse vending machine. I don't know how it's going to work. It's going to be, I would imagine, to be similar enough to how the WE scheme works rather than the deposit return scheme.
Yeah, a huge amount to consider there, and it'll be interesting to see what changes come about in the area. Sid, I was wondering as well, has there been a moment in your career that you're particularly proud of, maybe a project or initiative that you worked on?
There's a good few, but I think the the best thing I've done, in my opinion, since I've worked, I'm 26 years in the council now, but I spent about 6 to 8 years maybe working in the southeast area office, where at that stage I was involved with the Dublin City Canals group, which was a group of statutory bodies and voluntary bodies and clean-up groups that would come together to try and promote and develop the canal. And there's one group, the Inland Waterways Association of Ireland, who are a volunteer group. They're the people that own all the barges you see going up in the canal. So they do a rally each year in May, and they come up to the Royal Canal and they meet in the Grand Canal dock, and then they go back out the Grand Canal. So I was thinking, I'd seen this Fizz Fest that was on over in Fisborough, which was the first week, the week they're coming up the Grand Canal. I thought, we have got a lovely site there at Portobello Harbour where we could try and do some kind of a music event. Now, at that stage I was in bands and I was involved in the music scene in Dublin anyway. So I put this proposal together, and then just through reaching out to local businesses in Rathmines and through some of the people I knew in the music industry, we ended up developing this thing called Canalaphonic Music and Culture Festival, which was it ended up being 2 days the first year. There was 25 venues, everything from all the pubs, all the coffee shops, all libraries, art galleries. We had everything from spoken word to poetry to trad music to heavy metal to whatever. And the pinnacle of it was we had a stage built on a barge at Portobello Harbour. It ended up running for 3 years. It was uber successful the first year, but unfortunately we weren't able to catch lightning in the bottle due to outside influences. But I think that just from my own personal perspective, I'm into music and culture and literature and all that sort of stuff. To me, that was like combining my transferable skills from outside work, putting them together, and just, creating a whopper music festival, So I think that was probably the best thing I've personally been involved with, and how they let me do it, I still don't know.
Awesome. Sid, I think that we're coming close to the end of time now, but I was wondering before we kind of wrap up, is there any advice that you'd maybe give to the listeners at home for what they can do to manage their waste and recycle more effectively? Mm-hmm.
Well, the number one is to reduce the amount of stuff you buy. If you're reduce is
the reason it's listed first.
Yeah, reduce, absolutely. But reduce. Recycle, so for example, if you're doing your food shopping, make a plan. Plan your meals for the week. Don't just go and buy a lot of stuff you're going to throw in the bin 3 days later. Try, if you can, to buy loose products so that you're not getting as much packaging. Stay away from fast fashion. But just reduce is the number one thing we can do. And then recycle properly. Make sure when you're actually if you're lucky enough to have a household waste collection where you can dispose of recyclables through that, do that. And we have a lot of waste streams in our bring centres. Well, all the waste streams in our bring centres are free apart from garden waste. There's charges in the civic amenity sites for bulky waste and construction demolition waste and hazardous waste and all that sort of stuff. But reduce, and then maybe darn your socks as opposed to throwing them in and on your bunny your pair. Reduce, repair, and dispose of properly. Don't just lump everything into your black bin because it's going to just end up going into the incinerator.
Absolutely. Well, we will leave it there. So thank you so much for joining us today on the What's the Story Dublin podcast. I think we've all learned so much. So Thank you so much for taking the time.
Glad to be here. Thank you very much for having me.
And thanks again to today's guest, Sid Daly. I'd also like to extend my thanks to our audio engineer and editor, Robert Fay. This podcast was produced by myself, Deirdre Malumbi, and Michael Ryan, and recorded in the Central Library studio. Be sure to spread the word if you're enjoying What's the Story Dublin, and to like and subscribe for future episodes. Slán go fóill.